The Canon R8 might just be my favorite travel camera right now, but is it perfect? No. So I figured it's about time I gave it a full review and talked about the good and the not so good when it comes to this awesome little full frame camera. So first of all, I have had the Canon R8 pretty much since release, and this has allowed me to put it through its paces in most circumstances and use cases. But I have particularly loved using this camera in two specific use cases, and that is travel photography and street photography. The R8's small size makes for the perfect travel camera and an inconspicuous street camera. It's been on many adventures with me now and has not let me down, particularly in the photo quality department. The R8 shares the same full-frame 24 megapixel sensor as the Canon R6 Mark II, which is another camera I have owned and tested a great deal, so I already knew that the R8 would have amazing photo image quality. And I'm glad to say, in terms of photo image quality, there's been no compromises made when putting that amazing full-frame sensor into this smaller body. 24 megapixels is the perfect sensor size for travel photography in my opinion, and this sensor crops very, very well and punches way above its 24 megapixel weight class in terms of detail and croppability in my opinion, rendering the finer details of busy landscapes and cityscapes like this beautifully. I put the R8 and the R6 Mark II up against my 45 megapixel R5, and these cameras get seriously close to the R5 in terms of its ability to crop into finer details of an image. But a good travel camera needs to be able to capture candid, often fleeting moments confidently, and the Canon R8 has not let me down in that department. Even with the more budget-friendly RF lenses, the R8 is one of the faster and more accurate focusing cameras I have ever used. Its autofocus and subject detection is just so reliable, and I cannot think back to any circumstances where it missed a beat for me. This sensor has great dynamic range too, dealing with contrasty, challenging scenes effortlessly and retaining all that detail in the recovered areas too. So even in circumstances where I didn't quite get the exposure right, this sensor is extremely forgiving. But without a doubt, my favorite thing about this camera is the colors. This sensor just makes the mundane look interesting, and it's slowly replacing my Fujifilm X100V as my favorite straight out of camera look, especially for candid street moments like these when traveling. It delivers vibrant colours in a much softer way than some of the earlier Canon mirrorless cameras, along with a more gentle contrast curve with very little editing required in post. My favourite lenses to use on the Canon R8 for travel photography and street stuff is definitely the smaller, cheaper RF prime lenses like the 28mm 2.8 and the 35mm 1.8. And although this is my go-to camera for travel and street, it is absolutely at home shooting portraits too. From its near perfect eye detection autofocus to how it renders really detailed portraits with plenty of skin detail for retouching, even on the cheaper prime lenses like the RF 50mm 1.8. As I said earlier, it compares really well to my 45 megapixel Canon R5, just with slightly better colours and not overkill in the skin detail department. And this camera really does have those classic Canon colours and skin tones that people love, thanks to sharing the same sensor as the Canon R6 Mark II, which is my favourite of all the recent Canon cameras in terms of its colour science. Portraits and skin tones have a natural yet warm look, really lending themselves to flattering shots, again with minimal effort in post. I've also shot some wedding content with this camera, which allowed me to test it out in less than ideal lighting scenarios, and the files cleaned up nicely in low light situations. The R8 would be a great little camera for weddings thanks to its amazing autofocus and low light capabilities. 24 megapixel sensor is the perfect resolution, and it has beautiful colors if it wasn't for the fact that it just had a single card slot. So today's video is sponsored by Squarespace, and I have trusted Squarespace for years to be the best platform for my online portfolio and for growing my wedding photography business. From day one, using Squarespace to build my website has been seamless and simple thanks to its easy to use fluid engine, meaning no prior experience in website building is necessary to create a professional looking website. Squarespace's customizable galleries allow me to showcase my work to potential clients, whether that's on my personal portfolio or on my wedding photography website. Squarespace also offers all the tools that you need to create your own online store and start selling both physical or digital products. So if you're ready to dive in and start creating your own perfect website with Squarespace, head on over to squarespace.com/JamesReader to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain using the code JamesReader. So now onto video, and the R8 is a little cinematic powerhouse, again sharing the same sensor and most of the capabilities of the much more expensive Canon R6 Mark II. So that means, again, amazing color science, especially when you use that C-Log-free color profile and the cinema gamut color space. For travel stuff like this, I just throw on a C-Log-free to Rec 709 conversion LUT from Gamut and a creative LUT from their kinetic pack, and that's about it. It's really easy to get a great image from this camera thanks to its sharp image and 10-bit color. In terms of exposure, I just tend to expose to the right a stop or so, and I have always been really happy with the dynamic range from this camera too in video. One thing to bear in mind is that the Canon R8 does not have IBIS though, so for casual run and gun stuff, I tend to rely on the smaller stabilized primes like the 35mm 1.8 or a zoom lens like the RF 15-35 2.8. Now the lack of IBIS is a complicated one because for me it's not really that much of a negative because I've never been a huge fan of Canon's IBIS on their other mirrorless cameras like the R6 and the R5, just because of that wobbling and artifacting in the corners on wider lenses. And to be honest, one thing that Canon really got right with the RF mount is that there are plenty of budget-friendly stabilized lenses, which I think do a better job than the IBIS anyway. I actually recently shot some anamorphic footage for the lens manufacturer Sore using just the Canon R8, which meant that I was running with no stabilization at all, and I actually really liked the natural look and cadence of the image. You can of course always stabilize a little bit in post, and when doing that I am generally always happy with the results. Now the R8 without a doubt has some of the best quality 4K 60p on the market. It is super sharp and detailed and has no crop. There are many more expensive cameras on the market that crop in on 4K 60p even as much as an APS-C crop. But on the R8 you get to enjoy that full frame sensor look. The Canon R8 along with the R6 Mark II also has pretty much the best low light capabilities of any of the other Canon RF cameras. I have pushed it up to around 10,000 ISO, and it not only retains a pretty clean image overall, but it hangs on to sharpness really well, better than a lot of the competition. There's no noise reduction at all on these shots, but if you're willing to add a little bit in post, then it stays really clean, even right up to 12,000 ISO, for example. So in terms of battery life, the more I have used this camera, the more I have been impressed with its battery life. At least when you compare it to other travel cameras, so it is much better than say my Fujifilm X100V, for example. I recently spent a whole day comparing the two of those cameras, which have pretty similar size batteries. And by the end of the day, the X100V had pretty much ran out, but the R8 still had a full battery. Yes, it's not as good as the R6 Mark II, as it does use a smaller battery, and it's probably not even as good as the older EOS R cameras like the EOS R or the R6, but I've actually been surprised how little they have compromised in terms of battery life despite using this smaller battery. It's worth bearing in mind too that these smaller batteries are cheaper than the bigger batteries that the R6 and the R5 need, for example. I have also not had my Canon R8 overheat on me once in video, and it's not even shown the warning when out in the field. I have tested it though, and it will probably overheat in 4K 60p with enough use, but I've generally found that the battery will die on you long before that becomes an issue anyway. So on to build and ergonomics, where for me the Canon R8 has struck the best balance between reducing size and weight while still having really good ergonomics compared to any other small camera on the market, especially small full frame cameras. With the smaller RF primes, it fits into pretty much any sling or camera bag effortlessly. Sure, it does have a shrunken grip compared to something like the R6 II or the R5, but it's still very comfortable to hold and doesn't sacrifice on button placement either. Carrying it around for a full day of exploring a city was such a pleasure thanks to its lightweight design and comfortable grip. It's also actually surprisingly coped really well in the rain, so seems fairly weather resistant even when using these non-weather sealed cheaper primes. It has a vibrant, excellent quality and accurate fully articulating screen and an amazing viewfinder. It's also the perfect hybrid camera thanks to this quick switch that allows you to toggle very quickly between photo and video modes on the fly. One gripe for me is definitely the lack of a command wheel, which is replaced by an annoying D-pad, and also the absence of a joystick. Okay, so the Canon R8 is without a doubt a great camera, but it does have some cons and some compromises, so let's run through them quickly. Con number one is that there is no fully mechanical shutter option on this camera. It does of course have an electronic first curtain shutter mode, but that maxes out at 1/4000, so when using a fast prime on a sunny day, I found myself hitting that max shutter speed quite often, which is a shame and meant I have to stop down or use an ND filter. Con number two is some of the things that are missing from the Canon R8 body that I don't think you can blame solely on the reduced size. It's definitely the lack of joystick for me, which even smaller cameras like the X100V have, and especially the lack of a command dial. I always use this to control aperture, so I really miss it when I don't have it. Another omission from the Canon R8's body is dual card slots, as the R8 only comes with a single card slot. Con number three is an obvious one, and that's that the R8 lacks IBIS, which is going to be a shame to most people for both photo and video. Con number four is that if you are like me and buying the Canon R8 to slot in alongside other Canon RF full frame cameras, it unfortunately will not share the same batteries as them, so that means you're going to have to pick up separate batteries for your R8 and your R6 Mark II and R5, for example. So that rounds out my review, and without a doubt the Canon R8 is probably my favourite camera that Canon has released since the Canon R5. Canon have packed a surprising amount of performance into this small camera body, and it is just so fun to use. Yes, compromises have been made in order to accommodate this smaller body, but in general Canon have done a really good job of creating a really well-rounded camera for both photo and video despite these compromises. If you want to see how the Canon R8 stacks up against its bigger brother, the Canon R6 Mark II, then check out my other video where I comprehensively compare battery life, image quality and overheating between the two, as well as share raw files. Okay, thank you so much for watching, and we are almost at 10k subscribers, so please, if you haven't already and you want to, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking this video because it really does help. Thanks again as always for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one.